I'm modifying my RadioMaster TX16S to add buttons for the Kyber system. Step one, obviously, is to remove the battery. I printed out these little gimbal guards from Thingiverse so I can work on it without ruining the front. So there's two versions, one with heat insets and one without. I'm going to do the one with heat insets. So these have a side that's got a little barrel on it. So the object is to put that barrel into the spot and kind of snap it in. Make sure it's square. Then you use a soldering iron to just sort of sink it in. And the trick is to make sure that it's not at a weird angle when you're doing that. Alright, so the technique I settled on is just put some heat across the top of the inset until it starts to sink. That seems pretty good. Then I use this putty knife to make sure it's going in flat and square. So I need a little bit more heat on it. Right, that's flush. And this is ready for mounting. So I designed a drill template that I'll use to drill the holes. It's symmetrical, so it doesn't matter. You can't put it on upside down. I just decided I wanted the handle to still fold fully down. So I made it so that it will go to its normal height. And I'm going to mount this whole assembly right there. Once you're happy with where it's going to be, I just taped it down so it didn't slide around. And then I'll take the back off and drill the holes. To get the back off this transmitter, there's 4 screws in the back that you need to remove. And then there's 2 screws on top. They don't technically have to come out, but if you remove this base, this cover, it kind of snaps into it, so it's just easier just to at least make this so it's not tight. And then the whole thing will come off and get us inside the transmitter. Forgot you have to take these side grips off. They just snap in. And now it'll come out. All right, there's a little wire that connects the speaker. So be careful of that. I'm going to set this whole thing down next door. In fact, I'm just going to detach this for now. All right, so that came out of here. This plugs in here. You can't mix them up because one's male, one's female. I'm just going to use this spool of tape to set it on so I don't damage anything for the drilling. These are M3 screws, so I'll use a 3mm drill bit. Alright, just pull off the guide, get rid of any plastic shavings that may be left over. And this is ready to mount using M3 10mm screws. And but before we do that, we need to mount the targets, or the switches supports. Alright, so the way this works, these buttons have a ground pin, and then each button has its own contact pin. And these are designed to go in a specific way so that the buttons are supported, and you can get wires through these little channels, and they're going to all feed out into this area here. So make sure you put the buttons in so that they match the support, and then this whole thing will get screwed in using these through screws onto this base plate, and you'll mount that after it's soldered and the wires are in place, and the wires will route through these holes respectively. And this little cover will cover the wires up and get trapped in position. I'm explaining it now while there's not a big mess of wires in the way. And once that's all screwed in and the wires are hanging out, we'll mount this whole thing onto the back of the transmitter. But that's kind of an overview of what's going on with these buttons. So the next step is to solder some wires onto these pins, and then route the wires through these little channels and through that hole. And it's going to end up in this device here, which snaps into this spot here nicely. And there's these two little breakouts. I'm going to pop one of those out so that we can run the wires off the back of the Kyber into the receiver. And it's only these three wires here that get mounted. So this will be a big bundle of wires connected probably that far away. So I'll use that as kind of a guide. We don't want too many wires, because then you just have to pack it all into this little spot here. And I've left this little channel here so that you can still get access to the pins for programming stuff out of the back. Alright, off to the fun part of soldering. Oh, I don't know. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 14, 21 wires to this. And those wires are going to get soldered to the Kyber. And with this switch, it's got a common ground. So I did some testing with the meter, and I found that these circular pins are all common. They connect to each other. So if I put a meter on circle pins, circle to circle, that's common. And if I do anything else except circles, it doesn't beep. So these, the two pins that are closest together, this is ground, and that is the actual button press. So to simulate a button press, we touch these two. They don't touch. When I push the button, these pins for each button will get connected to the square pads. And it doesn't really matter which button goes to which pad, because at the end of the day, you're going to program them all in Kyber and assign them numbers anyway. So I'm going to try to keep them in order, but if they get out of order, it doesn't really matter, because when you set it up under Kyber, you'll press a button, see what number it is, and then set that number in sequence. So I was wrong. These are not actually breakout panels. They're just look like they should be. So I'm just going to use one of these unibits, because they drill nicely into plastic without splintering or smashing out. Try to hit the center mass there. And I'm going to drill a hole big enough to get some wires through. I only need to get 3 through there. So that should be plenty right there. Just need to get 3 little wires through to go into the Kyber. So I'm going to use a 26 gauge silicon wire. Got this off of Amazon. It's pretty thin. Doesn't need to do a lot of work, but you also don't want a giant bundle of wires everywhere to end up as a big rat's nest in here. So the thinner wire is going to work better. I do have multiple colors, so I'll just try to use them in order. So the 2 pins closest together, the farthest one is ground. So I'm just going to do a measurement. So this is going to flip over and live here, and it's got to go to, let's say, the farthest one. And then some play, so that's actually not a bad length. See if I can come up with some kind of standard length. So they'll all be roughly the same. So if I don't move this, that looks like that is plenty. So I'll slice up some wires and then get to soldering. So first step is to tin the wire and the pin. And this will be a trick. All right, that looks pretty good. I'm probably going to put some heat shrink on that just to keep it from walking away from me. So just check when you put, if you put heat shrink on there, that you don't put so much that it won't turn this corner nicely. So it's not putting any stress on that wire. So don't put too much. All right, this is the most tedious part. So I've got all the wires soldered up. What it is, I put the backing block and I lined it up with the switch to see what channels each wire needed to go through, and then just routed them individually so that there's a minimum of tangling and rat's nesting going on. I would suggest that you grab a nice pair of tweezers to help you kind of root these as necessary, and then just slowly pull out the slack, trying not to get tangles, and then flip this over and it should sit nicely on top of the switch back. Looks like the red one is, there we go. And then when you get enough of it, oops, it's actually going through one extra. You should end up with a nice bundle of wires that will send through this channel here, this one here. Once we get the rest of the wires in position, and then that thing will get screwed to the back. The whole point of doing this with the channels is so that you don't get your wires pinched. You can see my green one just a little bit too long, so I'm just going to reduce some of the stress on that. The blue and the white. Alright, that looks pretty good. I'm going to do the same thing for the 3 buttons. And then this will be ready to be mounted. Alright, so I've got the wires threaded into their channels. And I've got the backer board mounted with 3 M310 screws. Then just put the cover on. Being careful not to pinch any wires that may be floating around here. This is a kind of a tight fit. It's meant to be. And then this is held on with 3 M310 screws here. And I'll do that. Although you can put M310s in there, I'm putting M38s because I have them on hand. It's just less turns of the screwdriver. They're plenty long enough to do the trick. It just takes less time and spins. Don't over tighten these. No need to. As long as they're snug. There's only a 1.5 millimeters or 2 millimeters of plastic here, so it's not got a lot of work to do. Just make it flush so it doesn't rattle. It doesn't stick out. Alright, the buttons are not mushy. They click nicely. So now on to the other side. Alright, so I've got the second side wired up. What I did was I took all the downstream wires here and went through this peg, and then the ones that were upstream of that I went backwards through. So they're both kind of corralled in that spot. And now, this will be tricky, but we're going to put the cover on, but we're not going to bolt it down just yet because we have to put the wire cover on. And notice it's got one side's a little different. So that side is going to go, let me pull this red wire. So since it doesn't have a symmetrical casing, it's a little bit different. So that side's a little longer. So just trying to squeeze this into position like that. And that should hold that on. And again, these will take M10s, but I'm going to use M8s just because I have them here. Don't over tighten these, just so they're flush and snug. All right, so I did a little poking around, and I figured out the potentiometer I was looking at is called S2, I believe. Yeah, S2. So I was going to use that. Just rob that channel and delete it. I use that one for the volume, S1. So I went to pull those wires out, only to find that S1 and S2 share a common ground. And I was like, all right, so it's these wires here, black, white, red, yellow, blue, and ground goes to both of them. And using my meter, I determined that white and red go to the left one, and yellow and blue go to the right one. And then the question is, which one is the signal and which one is the positive lead? And I was able to figure out that the red one is just power and the white one is the signal, and the black one is ground. And so hooking it up to the board, the red one goes to plus, the white one goes to S, and the black one goes to minus. And then I had the problem of, well, I got to splice this because it still has to go to the board. And then I saw, oh, wait a minute. What's this here? This is the left slider, which is also a potentiometer channel. And it has the same black, white, and red wires and a nice long lead. So my plan is to snip this and then solder it to the board and plug it back into the left slider junction box or plug. And that saves me a whole heck of a lot of time and trouble. So that's the plan. All right, so here's my completed wiring harness. The important thing to note with these buttons is that the buttons all go to square pads and the grounds go to the round pads. So you can see that only 3 grounds are connected, 1 ground for each button pad, and the rest of the pins go to the squares. So all these open circles are open, except for the corresponding grounds for each button pad. Now I'm going to plug this in after installing it into the case. To test everything before putting it back together, take a multimeter, set it to 20K, and put one lead on S and the minus lead on the minus, and then press each button to make sure you have individual values. On mine, my meter showed 9.87 with no buttons pressed, then each button should have a unique and different value that should be steady. So I wrote down the values that I get when I do button presses. On a static, no button press, I get 9.87. And most of these buttons are pretty reliable. I hit this, I get 1.647 every time. I hit this button, I get 3.299 every time. But I've got a couple of buttons that just don't seem to settle down. Like this one here, I press it, and there we go. See how it just jumps around? It's 2 point something. It's all over the place. Probably has a loose connection or bad solder because it's not settling down. Once you have steady button presses, you can put everything together. All right, so step one to assemble it is to push the board through. I guess if you had super long wires, you could have done this step first. But I didn't want to have a giant extra large size rat's nest in there. So I'm doing it now. So now all these wires are going to be living in here. And the Kyber is going to mount in there with this little adapter pad, which slides on here, and then there's little channels for it to be received, and then you got to kind of work this down. It's got a tight fit on purpose because I didn't want this thing flopping around inside the transmitter. Be careful not to snap anything. These will flex a little bit. I printed this in PETG so that it does flex a little bit. And when it gets to the bottom, there's little channels that it actually snaps into. Be careful you're not pinching any wires. This is the fin. Oh, there we go. All right, so that should snap in and be flush. And then all the wires should be corralled somewhat nicely. We'll plug our lead in through there. And this whole shooting match, again, being careful not to snap or pinch any of your wires. That snaps onto the back like so. Then these wires get tucked in a non-pinchy fashion. There's actually room in the case for some of these wires to live, so I can push them back up into this wire cover. And then we want to fetch some M10 screws. I'm just going to do this until it bites. continue with the other ones. I guess I should have just tried to visually line it up here. Aha, there's one of them. I think if I were to do this again, I would connect the speaker next, not beforehand. Alright, I know I'm freaking out about that speaker and a screwdriver too. We just want that piece to lay flat onto the back of the transmitter back. Alright, everything seems solid. Nothing wiggling. Alright, so I got a little tail here. All these are in here. The wires are neatly tucked away. All the buttons pressed nicely. Everything's tight. So it's time to put it back together. To do that, I'm going to start with the speaker wires. We'll go with the longest first. And then this wire. And then finally, our last wire, and then we're going to close the case. There we go. All right, make sure you're not pinching any wires. And the case should feel smooth all the way around. I think I have a little bit of a alignment problem still. Oh, that's it. See how this is above that? It's not supposed to be. All right, just make sure those are snug. All right, I'm happy with all those. So the last step is to put the battery on. All right, and now the moment of truth.
Welcome to OpenTX.
Well, that's a good sound. Takes a second to boot up. All right, so I've set this up so that channel 7 is my button channel. So as I press each button, you can see here on channel 7, I get discrete values for each different button press. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. So, here's something that's super important. When you're first installing this, you may get button values that are, many of them are the same, or it doesn't register all the buttons. So go into System, and then Page, it says Calibration. Hit Select over here, and then you want to calibrate all of your button presses. So it says press Enter. Center sticks and pots, and hit Enter. So now you move the joysticks in their full range, kind of slowly, like you're controlling it. You can see how when it first starts, it jumps all the way because it doesn't know where the entire range is. So we're teaching the transmitter the range of all of the buttons and all of the sliders. So we got volume, and you can see the little slider moving at the bottom. So move those the full ranges. And finally, these buttons here are also calibrating. So that's 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 for your different models. So I've taken this slider away and wired all the buttons into it. So now that everything's calibrated, the system will work. And if you skip that step, it's just not going to work. So press Enter. All right, and just to double check, if you press long hold, you get to this screen here, and then you can see what channel you set up for your buttons. All the buttons work, and they're all discrete. That's the most important step, and that's how you do this mod to TX16S transmitter. So now that we're happy with it, we'll go ahead and put the side panels back on. So they just slide in at the top and then snap in on the side. Okay, we are ready to go.